Limited run games landed a big one with its 6th release, indie darling Octodad, Dadliest Catch. Originally released in 2014, Dadliest Catch was the critically lauded follow-up to an inventive adventure called, simply, Octodad. The original Octodad was one of those early definitive indie games. Released as a free title for personal computers, developed as a student project, cheerfully defying conventional thought about how video games need to be easy to control and cooperative with the player's intentions. Octodad was whimsical, creative, frustrating, and utterly addicting. The sequel followed in the original game's footsteps. Maybe that's the wrong term to use here. After all, Octodad himself doesn't have feet, only a set of 8 pseudopodia, a few of which masquerade as human appendages. And in fact, that's the entire point. Masquerading as a human, despite the fact that the lead character is, in reality, an octopus. Not a walking, talking octopus, just an octopus doing its best to mimic human behavior despite getting about on tentacles and speaking through a series of comical cartoon mumbles.
Captain?
From this nonsensical basic premise, the entirety of the game unfolds, both the action and the story. Players guide the deceptive patriarch protagonist through a series of increasingly contrived scenarios, doing their best to perform basic daily human tasks without giving away the hero's true nature. Octodad loves his life as an alleged human, but he knows his identity is only as secure as his ability to stay beneath the proverbial radar. Though the people in Octodad's life are cheerfully oblivious to the world around him, they're also not necessarily friendly toward imposters. A fact that is never far from mine, thanks to the perpetual schemes of sushi chef Fujimoto, who stalks Octodad like some sort of Jean Valjean with kitchen knives, hoping to expose and presumably butcher the cunning cephalopod. Mechanically, Octodad calls back to early indie experimental game projects like QWOP, a 2008 Flash game by Bennett Foddy. QWOP took the concept of ragdoll physics to its most ridiculous extreme. Players had to use 4 keyboard buttons, Q, W, O, and P, to control the 4 limbs of an Olympic runner. Less a traditional video game than a maddening toy, QWOP translated the autonomic muscle control the majority of people take for granted into separate, consciously controlled tasks. When most of us want to run, we don't think about it, we automatically shift our center of gravity and move our legs. But what if you had to control each of these actions one by one with deliberate thought? Suddenly the process of moving, let alone running, let alone winning a race, becomes a daunting challenge. Octodad takes the QWOP concept and expands it far beyond a bite-sized attempt to complete a single race. In growing to become the basis of an entire slice-of-life adventure, the limb-by-limb control mechanics take on a less complex form, not to mention a less infuriating one. At the same time, they gain considerable nuance, allowing the player to do far more than simply move around. Octodad can shuffle around through 3D spaces, climb obstacles, manipulate objects, and even play games within the game. Dadliest Catch takes the fumbling ragdoll controls of interactive physics toys and turns them into the basis of a game whose emergent inanity is every bit as hilarious as its extensive tongue-in-cheek voiced dialogue. As much as Octodad appears to owe QWOP and other ragdoll physics sims, its development team has acknowledged many other influences on the game. Foremost among these is Jurassic Park Trespasser, one of gaming's most infamous examples of good intentions gone awry. Published in 1998 by Electronic Arts and produced by Seamus Blackley, who would go on to be known as the father of the Xbox and a world-renowned bread expert, Trespasser dropped players into a first-person survival adventure on an island dominated by dinosaurs. Rather than simply asking them to shoot their way to safety, Trespasser instead gave them a direct connection to the world through complex physics programming and a highly interactive arm through which their on-screen avatar could manipulate and interact with in-game objects, weapons, tools, doors, and more. The idea being to create a profound sense of immersion and create a virtual reality-like sense of exploration and danger decades before commercial VR became a reality. In practice, this setup proved to be clumsy at best and turned Trespasser into a running joke. But Octodad developer Young Horses, a studio made up primarily of the former DePaul University students who had created the original Octodad, had a brainstorm. If Trespasser's granular limb interface had been the source of unintentional comedy, could something similar be harnessed for deliberate comedy? And thus, Octodad, a game where you control 3 limbs at once, and the comical slipperiness of the interface is the point of the affair. Dadliest Catch gives the dual analog controls of the PlayStation 4 and Vita a proper workout. You manipulate Octodad's legs, or rather the tentacles he's stuffed down his trouser legs, by pressing the shoulder triggers. Each trigger controls a separate leg. Meanwhile, you tap into the spirit of Trespasser with the right analog stick, which raises and lowers the height of the limb Octodad uses to approximate a human arm. Finally, tying it all together, the left analog stick controls the forward, backward, and lateral motion of whichever limb you're currently operating. Pressing forward causes that limb to tilt forward. Pulling back causes it to move backward. If you're manipulating all 3 limbs, they all respond simultaneously to the movement of the left stick. And the degree to which you're fiddling with each of the triggers and the right stick also factors in as well. If this sounds complicated, well, that's by design. It's meant to be complicated. In stark defiance of the general guideline that game control should be intuitive and friendly and easy to use, Octodad earns most of its traction and most of its appeal from the fact that the controls are in fact awful and confusing and hard to use. It shouldn't work, but it does. It helps that the game doesn't take itself at all seriously. The environments are littered with interactive objects, many of which make no sense. The game opens with a flashback to the wedding of Octodad and the love of his life, a human environmental activist named Scarlet. You need to find and don various bits of Octodad's tuxedo before completing the nuptials, but you also need to make your way down the aisle to where Scarlet awaits without causing so much ruckus that you reveal your inhuman nature. Never mind that walking down the aisle usually works the other way around. The aisle is inexplicably littered with banana peels. The idiocy of this opening scenario is your warning to buckle in for an adventure that makes very little effort to operate under any rules but its own. Everyone in the game loves Octodad, most of all his family, but they're all a little suspicious of his weird behavior. This of course raises the question of how he became an Octodad in the first place without Scarlet catching on to his basic nature. You'd think she might have noticed a few details amiss during the whole process involved in Octodad becoming a dad, twice. But you're not really meant to think that hard about the logistics of this game. Instead, you're meant to focus on navigating one outlandish scenario after the other. After making your way down the aisle, you go full trespasser in order to place an oversized novelty diamond ring on Scarlet's finger before fast-forwarding a decade to a seemingly normal morning in Octodad's domestic life. You'll make coffee, grill lunch, perform yard work, and sort out the grocery shopping throughout the first few stages, all while powering through comically taxing scenarios for which Octodad's freakish biology is simultaneously perfectly suited and yet ill-equipped to handle. Grab a frozen pizza from inside a busted freezer case by slipping up and down along the shelving. Climb a tower of soft drink boxes to snag the one bottle of mango soda circling around on a display prop overhead. Pilfer a box of cereal from another customer's cart while she's not looking. All in a day's work for an octopus that pretends to be a man. A big part of what makes Dadliest Catch work is that the developers clearly put a lot of effort into creating friction between the outlandish tasks and elaborate physics, but knew when to reel things in. The trials and tribulations of Octodad would be hellish if the game expected precision play on par with Quap or Trespasser, but the controls and in-game interactions both have a generous amount of forgiveness and automation built into them. For example, placing Scarlet's wedding band on her finger could have required pinpoint perfect aim, but as long as you can make the ring collide with her hand, you're fine. Octodad has the ability to snatch objects with the suction rings, and the interface considerately highlights the things you're about to snatch, which makes it much easier to wiggle your tentacle into the proper position to make the grab. By the time you've reached the aquarium's entertainment zone, trying to win redemption game prizes for Scarlet, or swapping electrical plugs to illuminate a giant fish sculpture for your daughter, the prospect of actually winning a ring toss or a target shooting game with the multi-limb control system seems far less overwhelming than you might expect. The game constantly ups its stakes and expectations with each new chapter and flashback, but the difficulty curve is both gradual and forgiving. Eventually you'll find yourself sliding around in a slippery, storm-tossed boat deck, trying to avoid pitching overboard as you fend off the advances of Chef Fujimoto, and it can be taxing, but it's far from impossible. Dadliest Catch really presents players with two kinds of challenge. First, there's the simple task of completing your objectives despite a control scheme that's uncooperative by design. There can be some sticky moments, like when Octodad's rubbery appendages become entangled with crates and cables, and you're forced to extricate yourself slowly, one limb at a time. There's also a secondary consideration, which turns Dadliest Catch into something akin to a stealth game. You need to avoid the scrutiny of actual humans. Too much fumbling and failure, and the complacent citizens of Suburbia will suddenly realize they've been infiltrated by an oceanic invader. But here too, the game errs on the side of generosity. You really have to screw up in order to earn a game over, even when you're fumbling about the boat deck in plain sight of vigilant sailors. In fact, by the end of the game, there's no getting around the fact that Octodad will be exposed for what he is in public. It's an imposter syndrome nightmare writ large. All the worse for the fact that Octodad really is an imposter. Or is he? After all, his wife loves him, his children adore him, and he provides them with a comfortable home. He's a model dad. It's just that he's, an octopus. The other major source of inspiration Young Horses has cited for Octodad isn't a game at all, but rather a movie. Charlie Kaufman and Spike Jonze's surreal masterpiece, Being John Malkovich. There, John Cusack and Cameron Diaz's characters find a hidden portal that takes them inside the mind of actor John Malkovich, and their experiences inside another person's head, wearing that person's body, inform the awkwardness and discomfort that permeates Octodad Dadliest Catch. It's a short game strongly driven by the story as it propels players from one objective to the next, but it's heavy on charm. The constant stream of running dialogue from the characters around you moves the story along and helps define the more or less silent protagonist and his family alike. In short, it's a charming little game that's engrossing on its first playthrough and encourages replay with dozens of hidden neckties to collect. It embodies the spirit of indie gaming with wacky controls, loads of charm, and graphics that compensate for their relative simplicity by surreally planting a disguised octopus smack dab in the middle of the pastoral American suburban dream. It's the same sort of whimsy that appears to define Young Horse's follow-up project, the upcoming adventure game Bugsnax. While Octodad Dadliest Catch has appeared on practically every gaming platform of the past decade, limited run games specifically published both the PlayStation 4 and Vita versions as catalog releases 10 and 11. The PS4 release is notable for being Limited Run's first flirtation with the collector's edition concept. Customers could opt to buy it in a special bundle that included a custom-made nautical necktie in embroidered silk, produced by our friends at Fangamer. A modest collector's edition to be sure, but definitely a first step on the road to some very impressive and very large boxes.